After the release of Phoenix Rising, I decided that my next project, which I'd had in the works for a little while, would be a series that brought everything I'd explored in the lore thus far together, for one final mini-series to cap off my lore-based work. This is what would end up becoming the first season of Infinity, but if the words final and mini-series sound odd to you, there's a reason for that. Infinity originally started out as a radically different series, which I began plotting whilst I was still writing the script for Shatterproof, about a year before the first episodes came out. On the whole, the first season of Infinity was a massive undertaking, and it was here where I had to contend not only with my usual issues of shooting long scripts and wrangling body actors and praying that I get voice lines in on time, but also with brand new problems too. I was shooting in Destiny 2 for the first time, I was new to the format of an extended series, and I was also starting to face burnout, exhaustion and disillusionment. What would eventually become Infinity started out as a project that I'd given the working title of Fireteam Osiris. The basic idea was to bring together the characters from my previous projects and eventually smash them all together into one fireteam, like a 10-year-old playing with action figures. The difference here was that I needed a plot. But considering the fact that the plot was always secondary to the premise, I do want to go over the composition of the fireteam a little bit first. It was always going to be 6 Guardians, Osiris was always going to be the leader, and Saint 14 and Toland were always going to be a part of it too. The remaining 3 slots were filled by, if my memory serves me right, Praedyth, Eriana, and, finally, Dredgen Yor. Yor was intended to be the wild card of the team, someone who was ostensibly on the side of the good guys, but whom nobody could ever really trust. It is interesting, I think, to consider that that concept made it through to Infinity essentially unchanged, only it was redistributed to Toland instead. Very early sketches of Fireteam Osiris had different lineups, with Wei Ning, Pahanin, and even Temur, one of the Iron Lords, featuring at various points. This was because I'd originally planned to script and shoot an Iron Lords project after Phoenix Rising, but during the production of Phoenix I realised that the amount of body actors I'd need for the major scenes would make it difficult, bordering on impossible to stage properly. I had no particular love for the plot, and in any case, I considered it well-trodden territory that would be too unwieldy to turn into a machinima. In any case, with the lineup finalised, I turned to writing my synopsis, which would later inform the basis of my draft script. Osiris would use a Vex Gate to travel through time and recruit his fireteam one by one, because he needed to stop Panoptes, who was intended to be the main villain. After recruiting and training his team, Osiris would come up with a weapon to stop Panoptes, which involved combining Warmind cells, Vault of Glass tech, and Hive swords, necessitating visits by the team to each of these locations. During the Warmind section, Yor would betray the team and would have to be killed by Toland. In the end, Panoptes would be defeated in a battle involving flashbacks, with the characters having to face their inner demons. After Panoptes' defeat, the characters would all return to their own timelines. It was a very formulaic structure: get people, get objects, defeat big bad guy. I'd plotted it to be shot in Destiny 1, and I'd started on a script for it, but towards the end of Phoenix Rising, I was hit by something of an epiphany. Instead of a fireteam that had to face Panoptes, whom I always considered a boring and bland villain, what if they had to fight Dredgen Yor? Not just the Dredgen Yor of corruption, but a Dredgen Yor that had, in an alternate timeline, won the duel on Dwindler's Ridge and had gone on to take over the solar system. I decided that this was a far superior idea, because it replaced a very boring villain with a very interesting one. It allowed me to construct an entirely alternate timeline of events, a sort of what-if scenario, which allowed me to turn everything that was true to the lore completely on its head, an idea which I thought would be incredibly fun to explore. The script for Infinity was written over the course of quite a long time. I started it shortly after Shatterproof was uploaded, and it took me just until after Phoenix Rising was uploaded to finish it, which is just over 4 months. I tend to write fast, but even so, the sheer scale of the project was daunting. My plot synopsis alone was longer than anything I'd ever written thus far, and I did wonder how I was going to pull it all off, but in the end, what kept me going was the strength of the core idea that I had, that dedication to taking the lore and twisting it, corrupting it, playing around with it. I tried to stay true to the essence of the characters and change the situation around them. Saint 14 is probably my favourite example of this. The plot is similar-ish to Darth Vader's, with the whole sort of evil, then redemption, then death kind of thing, but I wanted to make it a more considered transformation, and I also wanted to make it clear that Saint 14 isn't fighting for Yor because he wants to. It's because he was so completely broken from having Yor destroy the city that he simply just gives in. As a character, Saint 14 needs something to fight for, something to believe in, and in his grief he deceived himself into believing that what he was doing was good. Saint 14 has an actual character arc here, which is very different from Phoenix Rising, where he's essentially the same person all the way through. I felt very satisfied at how I pulled off his shift from light to dark and back again. And talking of dark and light, I deliberately established the idea of the Resistance to make it clear who was good and who was bad. It's quite simple really, if you're in the Resistance, you're good, if you work for Yor, you're bad, for the most part. Aside from Shinobu, who's only technically not in the Resistance, only 2 other major characters fall outside those boundaries, and so characters like Marcus Ren, and Pahanin, and Wei Ning, and Uros, and Callum Sol were quite easy to write because there was never much development or nuance to their morals. The plot wouldn't function without them at all, but they're always very clearly either good or bad. The 2 aforementioned characters, by the way, that don't neatly fit into the boxes of good or bad are Toland and the Outrider. The thing to remember about Toland and the way that I always consistently wrote him is that he always wants to bring down the bad guy, but he's not above doing questionable things to get there. In Season 1 at least, this is mostly just restricted to general maliciousness and he never really goes against any of the Resistance's direct orders. The Outrider is a slightly more interesting case. She's technically a character from the lore, specifically the lore from the Trinity Ghoul Bow, but the lore doesn't really say anything about her or her character, so I essentially had a blank canvas on which to work. I had fleetingly wondered about the idea of Guardians having children, and I thought it would be interesting to explore what it would be like to raise a child in the sci-fi world of Destiny. This kind of morphed into the whole Ryan subplot, where the Outrider's trying to find a cure for her sick son. Exactly what the sickness is deliberately left ambiguous, but it's clear that it's slowly killing Ryan. The Outrider's only allegiance is to her son and not to anyone else. She likes Pahanin but doesn't love him and is relatively indifferent towards everyone else, at least in Season 1. She's still one of my favourite characters though, because she feels so real. She works for Yor to save her son, but she's enough humanity to try and get food for Pahanin, and enough bravery to directly threaten Yor alone. Dredgen Yor himself was easy to write. He wants control and he wants power, but he's also clever. Clever enough to know how to manipulate people, how to break their wills, and how to turn them to his side. He's something of an archetype of Emperor Palpatine in Star Wars, the true ruler of the galaxy who stays hidden in his throne room for most of the time. The difference is that Yor can fight. In Corruption, this is explored a little bit with him beating Thalor and Holborn, but in Infinity I really wanted to emphasise just how good of a hand-to-hand combatant Yor is. He doesn't rely on just firing Thorn at his enemies, or zapping them with lightning, or getting his lackeys to deal with them. He fights hard and fast, and this is reflected not just in the actual fight scenes, but in Eriana's description of how Yor came to power, with him defeating Kallus alone single-handedly. I built up the idea that Yor couldn't really be beaten in a straight-up fight, which made him feel invincible, necessitating Toland's weapon. The weapon is a MacGuffin and something of a holdover from Fireteam Osiris, but it does give the plot a much-needed forward momentum. If you look at Phoenix Rising and Corruption, they're both quite aimless and meandering for a lot of their runtime. Things do happen, but it's hard to see the trajectory of the overall story. This is fine for a self-contained feature-length project, But with a series, you kind of need an overarching goal to work towards, and Toland's weapon provides this quite well. It also leaves a lot of the room for the rest of the story to play out alongside it. For example, almost all of the entire 6th episode is in flashbacks and conversations that have nothing to do, really, with the main plot of getting the weapon to kill Dredge and Yor. This degree of space, of things taking a little bit more time and happening a little bit more slowly, was the thing I noticed most about switching from writing movies to writing a series. That, and having to parcel out the plot into neatly divided episodes. I chose 8 episodes as an arbitrary number, knowing that some episodes were invariably going to be longer than others. The longest episode by far was the finale, during which the plot is resolved and Yor is killed. But the last scene with the Outrider is probably more important than most of the rest of the episode, because it sets up Season 4 of Infinity. The Ahamkara hints of something dangerous being in the portal, which is elaborated on in Season 2. At the time I scripted that scene knowing what was coming ahead in Season 4, although at that point it was Season 5. By contrast, Verity Osiris was only ever intended to be a single standalone miniseries, and Infinity initially started out that way too. At first, when I was writing the script, I only ever really intended for there to be 1, maybe 2 seasons. But when the ideas for characters and plots that would eventually boil down into Season 2 started to be thrown up, I decided to expand Infinity into a multi-season series. And considering I wrote all my scripts in linear order, this meant that I had enough time to add in that final scene that sets up the story to come. Shooting in Destiny 2 was relatively new to me. I'd shot a short machinima in Destiny 2 when it first came out, but this was done by using a glitch that disabled your guns using the companion app. By the time I got round to making Infinity, this had been well and thoroughly patched, as had every other exploit of its kind, including the sword glitch that was the de facto only camera method in Destiny 1. This left only 2 options for a camera mode. Firstly, you could sit against a wall in third person to force a first person perspective, but this is quite limited. You have to position yourself fairly tightly, your angle of view is somewhat restricted, you can't really move the camera in any way, and it requires suitable flat, high cover to back up against, which actually a lot of areas in Destiny 2 don't really have. The second option is what I'm going to refer to going forward as the submachine gun glitch. By rapidly and ceaselessly swapping between 2 SMGs in the primary and energy slots, the swap animation would overlap to result in a screen that was free of any gun models. Unfortunately, this also had significant downsides. For a start, it's physically demanding on your fingers, especially on a controller as I was using back then. You have to mash the Y button pretty fast without letting up for a single second, and even then you still risk the rogue flash of weapon at the bottom of the screen. Second, it produces this really annoying clicky noise, which means clean sync sound is essentially impossible. I typically don't tend to include ambient dialogue anyways for the likes of discussion scenes, so most of the time it wasn't a problem. But for fight scenes longer than a few seconds, there really was no avoiding it. Overdubs, which I did make extensive use of elsewhere, would be far too complicated and would sound obviously artificial anyways in a more lengthy and unpredictable fight, so the only real solution was just to keep the click noise in and hope that it wasn't too grating. Aside from these new challenges, the shoot was similar in nature to my previous projects, only much more intense, given the sheer scale of the thing. The assassination attempt on Dredge and Yor that opens episode 4 was a highly demanding set piece to shoot, but by that point I was actually quite well organised and I was slightly more used to marshalling large groups of people for filming sessions, so it actually wasn't as much of a headache as it might have been if I'd done it earlier. The real problem was the sheer volume of footage that I needed. I shot as efficiently as I could, taking one scene at a time, but I was still much slower than I'd have liked to be. The extended sequences in Yor's Fortress towards the middle and ends of episodes 4 and 8 were shot very, very messily across multiple filming sessions. I was still using both my Xbox and Daniel's to shoot, which meant I only really needed one other body actor for a standard two-person discussion scene, but it became much more technically difficult to actually execute the shots because I had to keep mashing the Y button for the submachine gun glitch. If I needed to perform even a simple action with my body acting Xbox, I'd have to mash the Y button with one hand whilst walking or aiming or casting a super with the other hand, which was incredibly fiddly, and it took me ages to develop the dexterity and careful hand positioning to make that possible. My growing frustrations with each individual filming session eventually, during November of 2019, started to boil over into weariness. The scale of Infinity seemed insurmountable, and I felt as though I was trying to shoot an ocean of video with a rusty bucket. I tend to pride myself in speed when it comes to making machinima, even though it's not what I'd consider a healthy or sustainable mindset, and the snail's pace that I was going at frustrated me to no end. Objectively, I wasn't actually that slow compared to most of my peers, but what mattered was that I felt slow. I felt like even if I finished season 1 tomorrow, it would still be months overdue, and this left me in something of a rushed and low mood as the new year dawned. Thankfully, things picked up a bit after that. I received a spate of voice lines that I badly needed and managed to shoot several of the more challenging scenes in January of 2020, and so by the time February rolled around, I had essentially completed and shot all of season 1 of Infinity. The casting for Infinity was somewhat complicated. Because the entire premise of the series is, look at these old characters coming back, I wanted to retain as many aspects of said characters as possible. This extended, obviously, to their costume designs, most of them stick to the same type of armour and colour scheme, and it extended to the voice actors as well. I went down the cast list and sent messages to every single voice actor who had a returning role in Infinity, and although some gracefully declined to reprise their roles, most responders were more than happy to, which I am very grateful for. Because I didn't want to impose time limits on voice actors to reply to me, I waited until I'd confirmed every single role before sending out my casting call. The casting call itself was quite straightforward and I got a lot of good additions. This was probably the easiest part of the entire process of making season 1. Voice lines took wildly varying lengths of time to arrive in my inbox, ranging from days to months, which occasionally frustrated me. Not that I blame any particular voice actor for this, I should clarify, but at least I did count myself lucky that I had such a strong cast. The fact that I chose not to voice any characters myself, barring a small role as Commander Slater, certainly didn't hurt matters either. The editing of Season 1 was the last project I ever edited on Windows Movie Maker, and by this point I was definitely starting to run into major issues. For starters, the occasional pop-up of a submachine gun that I'd accidentally let through into the final video required fixing. I fixed this issue by removing the 1 or 2 frames of the gun being visible, and since most shots in Infinity are static discussion scenes with no proper movement, frame splicing like this can be quite unnoticeable if you're, using a proper editing program. And not Windows Movie Maker, which throws up editing glitches like there's no tomorrow. Even setting aside the fact that Movie Maker doesn't actually let you cut to the precision of individual frames, half the time my frame splicing didn't even matter because Movie Maker merely jams on a few extra frames either side of my edit. The exact frames I was trying to get rid of. This caused me quite a lot of headache to the extent that a few submachine gun glimpses are still left in Infinity, as much as I tried my best to remove as many of them as I could. Complaints about Windows Movie Maker aside, it did serve me fairly well over the course of my machinima work thus far, But the future flashes that Dredgen Yor inflicts on Osiris in episode 8 required more advanced tools. By randomly googling, I decided to try out HitFilm Express as my editor of choice in order to overlay various video clips on top of each other, something that you just can't do in Movie Maker. Stringing together that 40-second scene in HitFilm took quite a while because I struggled to adapt to the new editing workspace, which was much more complicated than I was used to. I also didn't like HitFilm's layout. It felt sluggish and unresponsive on my computer, and my file systems ended up a complete disorganised mess because of it. I uninstalled HitFilm after episode 8 was released, and it wouldn't be until season 2 of Infinity that I properly switched out my editing software, but that's a story for next time. Infinity took me just over a year to produce, which was shorter than the time it took me and Daniel to make Crota's Bane. But there were a few key differences between the two projects. With Crota's Bane, the entire experience of just making machinima, or just shooting random footage with Toland's sword, felt groundbreaking and exciting and novel. With Infinity, I'd already made over 4 hours of content before I even started, and the luster was starting to fade. I had Daniel's help and support while making Crota's Bane, both physically and emotionally. We kept each other motivated. With Infinity, I was doing it all by myself. Infinity was also longer than Crota's Bane, running it over twice the length. The splitting of the season into individual episodes was useful in getting parts of it out earlier, but it didn't reduce the workload that I had. And even though I was knocking out scenes left, right and centre, there was always more footage to shoot. All of this, I think, explains the fact that the overriding emotion I had when I released Season 1, Episode 8 of Infinity wasn't pride or happiness or satisfaction or even the hunger of moving on to something new. It was a very, very tired relief. Relief that I'd finally done what I'd set out to do. Relief that I didn't have to push myself to finish the season anymore. Relief that, if all else failed, at least I hadn't fallen at the first hurdle. I didn't realise it at the time, but Season 1 was the hardest season of Infinity for me to make on a technical level. I had so much to do, and the leap forwards was difficult, and it challenged every aspect of my creative and technical abilities. I had to learn how to write and pace a script which was triple the length of my longest works to date. I had to edit down several hours of voice lines and over 20 hours of video, and even the little touches like designing the distinctive red tinted thumbnails took a lot of effort because it involved learning Photoshop techniques that I hadn't even known existed before. Like I said, the feeling I got when I finished Season 1 of Infinity was relief above everything else. The pride didn't kick in until much later. But when it did, and looking back on Season 1 now, I do feel like I did my characters and my story justice, and the fact that the story was well and truly my own for the first time makes Infinity feel special. But I also had a lot of help from a lot of people, some of whom in particular were stunningly kind and upbeat, and I'll always appreciate their generosity, both of spirit and of their time. I've talked a lot here about myself and about how I felt and how I worked, but the hours that my hard-working voice cast, and especially my ever-suffering body actors, put in is just as equally the foundation of a project like Infinity. And for all the long, hard months of labour that I put into Infinity, I wouldn't be a very good director if I didn't acknowledge that too.